Well, welcome back after our comedy of technology errors this morning. We think we're together and we think everybody can hear us and broadcast successfully from 3 different locations. It's been an interesting 2 weeks, and it's hard to believe that the semester is sliding to an end so quickly. Today we're going to talk about health and illness issues, and we're going to just follow the lineup of the questions as they're presented in the written lecture. So the first one really talks about our general reaction to dealing with illness, to interacting with people who are ill, and it asks this interesting question whether the nature of the illness changes our interaction with those folks or not. So you want to take a stab at that, either of you?
I guess I'd just say everything in context, right? The way we approach people, everything we say, and everything, the way we talk to people depends on context. So I think, of course, it will. Doesn't change the overall message that we bring as pastoral leaders or pastoral care persons, but it does change the tone you may take and how you use the tools, how you use prayer, how you use humor, whether you do or not. In my limited pastoral care experience, I did some home care visits yesterday, and 2 of the people have dementia, and when you visit people with dementia, it's a different kind of visit. I mean, we could go into that for a long time, but I think I need to process that with someone, because it's, in some ways it feels like not a visit at all for
Sure.
me, but I know that it's important, and that I'm helping to hopefully bring God's presence. So I think, yes, the nature and severity of illness does change how we approach it.
And though we live with this illusion that we're going to live forever and we're not ill in the present moment, one of the interesting sentences that struck me was that all care, all medical care, is ultimately palliative. If you think of it over the long term, we are all going to suffer. We are all going to be ill in some way or another, and recognizing that illness is a part of what makes us human in a way, and that making people feel like they are part of the community of human beings simply because we all suffer. And that's our, that's kind of where I see the general reaction is. I think I've come to understand sort of a more communal, more relational approach.
Right. Yeah. And that sort of hints at the idea that puts us inside that community as caregivers as well. For some reason, this question sort of prompted me to think about my own ideas around illness personally as regards to myself, and how they might, sort of impact how I think about pastoral care. And I was realizing how much for myself, I really delineate, like, this is not a healthy thing. I really delineate between things that are accidental and things that I somehow imagine aren't, right? Like, so things that I thought I might have power over, like my immunity or,
heart disease or whatever. Yeah.
Right. I have a lot of blame directed at myself regarding, or I would have and do have a lot of blame towards myself in regard to those things, as opposed to things that appear more accidental. And so, I just took a moment to notice that and pay attention. And obviously, like, I would strive not to let those transfer over to pastoral care, but I can't do that if I haven't.
Right. That's part of that stuff that's there that you bring to the conversation, for sure.
Yeah.
Can we move to theological elements then? What kind of theology is present in conversations? We certainly saw some elements that I kind of regard as bad elements. I'm not going to say I'm in favor of Luther or the Stoic approach. What how does God come into all of this?
Well, at least in my experience with the prompts that are in the question, right? Hospital, hospice, and rehab. I definitely noticed comparing hospital and hospice that it's a different kind of crisis. So, acute versus chronic. And so there tended to be more wrestling in the acute crisis that I would notice, more of that active work, as our text would say, moving from an embedded to a deliberative theology. Like it was the precipitating event that was causing people to ask questions about their embedded theology and move to a deliberative one. And I honestly, when I moved from hospital work to hospice work, I actually expected to see more of that happening in hospice work, but I saw less, right? That people were actually more having different conversations with themselves. It was definitely more, I don't know how to describe it, like more like just coming to terms, like more like a going over memories, or more like sort of just a sense of coming to completion, which makes obvious sense when you think about it. But I don't know, I was just surprised that I think a lot of people are prompted to do that deliberative work throughout their lives as opposed to the end of their life. And so that's what I found.
That's interesting. I guess the message is, the message is the same in a lot of ways. We are, even in the hospice, we are still part of that community of people. We are, we're still going to die. And we're not sitting there as somebody outside looking in at someone who is going through something that is unrelated to us, I guess. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense or not.
Totally.
I guess what I was scared of most, and still am scared of in a way with going into CPE, is answering this question, or feeling that I have to deal with this question somehow of, why did God do this to me? Or why does God permit suffering to happen? Or why does, why? And I don't know. I think that's always going to be a struggle. The one formulation of it that's sort of vaguely theological is it comes from a woman. She's a German theologian, Sorel, I think is her name, Dorothy Sorel. She wrote a book called Suffering, and she says that you can't have it both ways. You can't have God as all loving and all powerful. You have to make a choice. If he's all powerful, then he's in charge of all of this stuff, right? And if he's all loving, he should never put people in awful positions. So if you have to choose one of those things to violate, they can't be true at the same time. Mm-hmm. Then she says, I'd rather opt for a God that is not all powerful, but is all loving. And I thought that was kind of it. I'm never going to use it in any kind of pastoral role necessarily, but it just clarified some things for me to help me think about things that I don't understand, mm-hmm. but that I think I have to deal with.
Well, I think your instincts are heading in the right direction for sure. I would have, when confronted with those questions, I wouldn't necessarily, in my experience, try to answer them, because I don't think we can ever give an answer that feels satisfactory. And what I think the person is asking for ultimately is to have a conversation about God, right?
Right,
the question why is actually what's behind that is, what kind of God do I believe in, which is exactly what you're saying. And so often I would steer that question towards, what does God look like for you? And after talking about that for a while, they would come to their own, they'd come to their own understanding of the why, based on their own, either, their own theology, whether or not it was changing or not. And
it may be too deep in the weeds, but just if you get into one of those conversations and you find someone who has this real limited view of God, this real limited view of the bean counter in the sky, or whatever it happens to be, keeping score, and you screwed up, so I'm zapping you now. other than suggesting that there might be alternatives, ways to look at it, I don't know what else. I don't know what else we can do, because that not baggage, but that embedded theology that they bring along kind of limits the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with the same thing, but I think that's where you have an opportunity. Like if Shada says you reflect, well, what kind of God do you believe in? And that's their answer. You can say, okay, that's different from what I believe. And I mean, you can share what you believe in some kind of limited or expanded way. I mean, I think we would both opt for limited, but just to say, I think God is present here between us and will help you through this. And, say that in whatever way you can.
Yeah.
My problem is trying to jump to that kind of thing too soon. And some of the readings this week really helped me think about how to wait on a lot of that and let people come to work through some of that on their own.
Any other thoughts about theological issues in this conversation? Well, then let's talk Luther. God knows best. He has a plan. How would that be received by parishioners today? I think there are a lot of people that believe that.
Yeah. I think
maybe it would be, somebody would say it more subtly, but the heart of the message is there. I think in a lot of people's.
Yeah, that's exactly what my notes when I was writing that is like, that we don't tend to use such blunt language anymore, but it's often behind a lot of the ways we respond to people in crisis, right? Like, especially the way we respond to people in grief. Because whatever that says about the kind of God we believe in, when we're in crisis, we often default to wanting God to be in charge, right? And it feels too unmoored to try to reframe it in any other way, because it feels just too unpredictable, right? And so we often default to this kind of thinking, which doesn't necessarily, it's not said so strongly, but it's still there.
And it goes back to that business about God being all powerful. I mean, I have to give that up, and that's a very frightening world.
Right. Or as might be more, it's not so much, well, yeah, I mean, it's about what we give up and what theological ideas we give up. But it's also about how God acts, or how God chooses to act, like that, in a sense, what God privileges, right? Our freedom, or respecting our own process. Like it's I think some people sometimes react theologically, like or resist the idea that God is limited, that somehow the way we're thinking about God is limiting God, right? It's like there's some dissonance there, right? Especially if you're thinking about God as all powerful, and they're like, well, you can't say God's not powerful just because you want to say it, but it can be framed in terms of like what God is choosing, right? How God is choosing to act with us and for what purposes, right? And then it becomes about God's agency, which I think is just a different way to think about it.
Yeah, it's a hugely tough topic to talk about, I think. So.
Yeah.
How about contrasting Luther's approach with the Stoic approach? This is we are going to learn something out of suffering, because suffering brings knowledge. React nobly to your suffering and suffer nobly. You can hear the sarcasm dripping from my voice.
Sure. Well, Adam, did you preach from John 9, like what, last Sunday?
Lazarus?
No.
Yes, I did.
The blind man and then.
Oh.
Yeah, no, Michael, we did that's what we did our
in parables. Yeah.
From parables, right?
Yeah.
He said, like, what will be revealed due to this man's suffering.
Yeah.
It's the same thing in Lazarus.
Yeah, I'm going to stay away and let him die because it'll be good for him.
And again, I mean, I don't know how you approach that in your class, but I did the same thing that I talked about with talking with people. I tried to turn that to show Jesus cries. He weeps. He's human. He knows. So because Jesus was human, he knows what we're going through in grief, even though he comes in and you know, the author of John's whole point is to show that, he says it at the end, this is the reason I wrote this book, to show that to show you science that you'll believe. But at the same time, he paints a human Jesus, a human God who walks with us. So yeah, I mean, I just laugh every time I see Stoicism, because I think I mentioned I grew up in Minnesota, in small towns where there are plenty of stoic Norwegian bachelor farmers who, I mean, grin and bear it, right? I mean, this is you see it on the faces. Nobody says this stuff out loud because they don't say anything out loud. But this is the kind of attitude about God that I grew up with. Well, that's how it is. Let's just keep going. We'll learn from that, and we'll carry on, which is okay. And I think it can carry some people, but I think it sounds like we all find that a bit unsatisfying to have as a deliberative theology. So I think there is something to it. Certainly we should learn from what happens to us, but to rely on only God teaches us lessons so that we'll, I don't know, be obedient, that's not complete for me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it comes back to this community thing again. I guess I'm stuck on it, but it's like, not only are we part of this community of people who suffer, but God has suffered the same way. So he becomes a part of that community, if you want to, so that we see ourselves vulnerable, but vulnerable in companionship with the God that, you know, goes through Good Friday and Holy Saturday.
Yeah, I think that's a key theological point, right? There's a real, it's not necessarily that I think it's theologically wrong to understand suffering as a potential teacher, but that it's how you understand it, right? Like, are we understanding God as inflicting suffering upon us so we can learn a lesson, right? Like, that feels inherently uncommunal, as you're saying, Michael, right? Like,
right.
It's separation. But once we bring in the resurrection picture, right? Once we bring in the cross and resurrection and it becomes a communal experience, well, that's different then, right? Like, God is not accepting God's self out of that whole picture, and therefore it feels different then to understand suffering as potential revelation when God is in it with us, right? As opposed to inflicting something on us. Yeah,
makes sense. Okay, how about the comfort in, dump out model, the circles? I don't know if you guys remember that, or do you want me to try to get it up on my... Not sure if I can get it
here, but
yeah, here it is. Let's see if I can make this happen. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean,
I shouldn't try anything fancy today, should I?
A very delicate.
Can you see it at this point?
Yeah, I can. It worked.
Were you impressed with this model as I was? I think, and Adam, you talked about silence earlier and when to use it. This really gave me kind of something to think about in terms of keeping my mouth shut more than open.
Right. Yeah, I think it's helpful in that, you know, we're in our role in CPE or as a pastor at a bedside or wherever. Yeah, if we dump in, right, it's just going to cause problems. it's just going to complicate things and make our message, our presence harder to hear. So, yeah.
I'd seen this before, and I've enjoyed it. What was new for me for this time was recognizing that the circles represented boundaries of care and not just words. If you know, like I'd sort of previously understood it in terms of what you, like I guess I had seen maybe the article it was in or something about what to say to people who are in crisis, and I was recognizing this, and also like how to act. No, so for example, like as someone who is typically sort of shy and introverted and really cares about words and meaning, like I've always been very careful about what I say to people in general, and specifically in pastoral care situations, almost to a fault, you know, like too much, and it stifles spontaneity and empathy. But so this sense of what you say to appropriately to people was not so new. But then I was realizing, oh, that this is also like boundaries of care, right? And so putting myself in this situation, for like example, if I were the aggrieved, or you know, or any of the inner circles, noticing how I might try to co-opt care outside of the proper circles, right? Like, so that I might try to take care of people going in the wrong direction.
Right,
so,
right.
So if I was aggrieved, I might try to take care of the people around me when that's their job, or just noticing at which points as a pastoral care practitioner, I might try to take over levels of these care that is not appropriate. Like, so just sort of recognizing, oh, okay, like where might I be tempted to skip levels of care because I want to feel some measure of control over the situation. So that's sort of what I was noticing for myself in that.
There's this evil kind of part of me that says maybe I don't have to take such great care of the looky-loos, as they call them on here. You know, like that's the boundary that's out there. And okay, you know, I mean, I get it. You're here for all that, but that's not what I'm here for, is to be part of the social scene of the circle. So, all right, I'm going to try to stop sharing this and see where we go. Back to me. Yay. Anything else on that model before we start to look at the book of Daniel? I'd like to do this kind of more informally and just talk through the three characters. If we talk about Daniel and the kind of care, and really to try to define the kind of illnesses that they each have, and then maybe the care or the plan that might go with that. I think we're supposed to try to talk about pain versus suffering, and the idea of choosing suffering, and curing and healing, and if there's an important difference for each of those.
Right.
And so, I'm not sure whether that's in context of these three characters or not, but.
Right, yeah, I wasn't sure if they're separate either, but.
Yeah. Well, let's give it a shot. Let's start with Daniel. I mean, without going through the two triangles or whatever, what can we say about him and his pain and suffering and all that sort of thing? And then where can we go in terms of a plan for him? I thought the one line, I think it was Nolan that they quoted, or Nelson maybe, the thirst behind the thirst, to try to look at what is the issue here, or constellation of issues that the Vicodin helps him with.
Right. Like, would you call his, is he in an acute or chronic situation? Like, I'm not even quite sure I know, like clearly the substance abuse is chronic, right?
Right.
But it's precipitated by, like crises, which, due to dramatic effect, or in a lot of sessions.
Moments.
So I don't know, like, I don't even know how we would say whether his problems are more acute or chronic. Yeah,
I'm thinking it's chronic. It's over the time period. And I think that the question of when he uses and why he uses seems to be in the writers, in the writers' minds. But there's obviously some bigger issues that are there that the crises may trigger the use, but I don't know. And then of course in this episode, he tries to go without for a couple of days. He, remember that scene where Jesus is sitting kind of up on the bookshelf and he says, well, I just really want a little bit of praise for doing this for 3 days without going to the pill bottle. And Jesus looks at him and says something like, well, you already know that. Why do I have to tell you that that's a good thing, or something like that? So is he in a state of addiction like this? Is there a difference in how we see suffering? Let's go back to something you said before, Shada, about like, do we blame him differently? Do we treat that differently?
Well, clearly, I mean, I think where they're trying to go narratively is that it's most of the family's reactions are like, it begins from them with the death of their son, right? Like that's, I mean, obviously there's lots of family dynamics they're hinting at as well, but in terms of like, like the events that have now shaping this trajectory that we're seeing, right? It sounds like the death of Peter's twin is the big thing that sort of hovers over it all. So for Daniel, I think any treatment plan regarding him and his addiction, I think probably has to start there in terms of like examining his embedded theology around losing a child and what that means.
And I think it's interesting that the bishop is set up as interested a little bit too much in alcohol. I mean, she has a conversation with the wife and says, she offers tea to the bishop, and the bishop goes, well, do you have any brandy? And it's like the morning, right? From the look of things in the day. So I don't think he has anybody to really be his counselor or his help person.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts about Daniel? Can you ever heal somebody from an addiction? Or is it simply cure?
Oh, good question. Well, I thought the question would be more like people would say, at least in terms of addiction theory, right? Isn't it that you can't actually cure an addiction, right? But more like it might be the other way around. Like you find a sense of, right? People are once an addict, always an addict, like that sense, right? So it's not a physical condition that can be cured, right? But a spiritual healing of the situations that lead someone to abuse can be healed. I mean, I think that's where it, right? I
don't pretend to understand addiction at all, but the whole idea of cure being related to the physical symptoms, and I think that they can be controlled or whatever, especially in this withdrawal situation that he was going through, for example. The symptoms can be treated, but the healing, the wholeness, does somebody who's addicted ever get to the place of wholeness? I don't know. I don't have an answer. I'm just asking the question.
I have no idea, but I think of addiction as, you're living with it. And coming back to suffering and pain, just those words always make me think of Buddhism and the idea that all is suffering. It's not necessarily the Christian understanding. It does have some links to original sin and brokenness of our world, but I tend to think of it as we all are broken in some way, and people who discover they're addicted or rely on that as their crutch live through that. Can they achieve wholeness? How much can any of us? That's what I always
I guess.
that's maybe a cop out, but I think it's partly true. How do we all live with the pain and suffering of our lives? And it is to varying degrees, to come back to an earlier question.
Mm-hmm. And if we go back to the formulation of loss and grief and violence, and then, how do you deal with stress? I guess you can choose other ways and you can move towards healing. And like you point out, it's like other chronic diseases. I get that. But I wonder if it's this special category or not. I don't have an answer on that one.
But if we're doing a plan of care.
Yeah.
Sorry, if we're doing a plan of care for him, clearly he needs to, that first step of acknowledging the problem, which he keeps doing off and on. But then, he needs someone to talk to, whether it's a group or a couple people.
Yeah, he keeps trying to go it alone, and he just doesn't seem like he has a network of care, right?
Right.
That would be something that would be important to establish.
Absolutely. How about Lorraine, the maid? Diabetes.
Chronic pain.
Chronic pain.
Decreasing mobility.
I thought that the interaction with her daughter was really interesting when Grace, the daughter in the family, calls her daughter, who's the doctor, and they're sitting at that table and they say, she says something like, "Don't you dare try to take away my agency here. Don't you dare be embarrassed about what I do."
Yeah. I was interested in the line where she said, "This is more than just a job."
Yeah, right.
And they've hinted as to how she came into the family and what she feels like she owes them.
Mm-hmm.
And so in any plan of care, I think an exploration of, her daughter said obligation, I think, a lot, or this sense of is she obligated to ignore her own health because of how she feels about maybe what she owes or how she is redeemed in this situation in helping the family. So yeah, I think there need to be some exploration around that issue, what
and I think that the daughter is a good example of jumping to conclusions. I mean, she sees the domestic help as a throwback to slavery. I mean, really, she's invested it with all kinds of things that for the mom, it may or may not have. So I think that that's one of those explorations that is going to involve what we bring to the pastoral care, but also what the character feels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think she's, how she came into the family. I think they referenced in an earlier episode that it was Daniel's mother who brought her in, right?
Right.
At a time when she needed a job. So yeah, I think she's trying to give back, right? She sees it as almost a calling, and as a family to some degree. But yeah, how to care for her in that understanding in this family that is her family and is not her family, as well as, putting that above her physical pain. I don't know.
Well, and I hate to go there, but this whole issue of medical marijuana raises its head there. And I think it is important to questions of pain and suffering and of curing and healing. Can her symptoms be controlled by this thing that is there? And that would go to any kind of palliative care, I'm sure, giving people
right.
doses of painkillers before their death and things like that. I mean, it seems to me that people's physical pain should be taken care of if it can be taken care of, right?
Right.
There's nothing noble about sitting back and suffering with feet that don't work and that hurt all the time if there's a method of dealing with it.
Right. Right. And that's caught up in all of the questions around, it becomes delicate, right? To what, right? Because pain management is about appropriate medications, and it is about recognizing new limitations, right? And so insofar as that, like, it doesn't make any sense to, as her daughter was talking about, to continue doing things that might cause more pain. Like, that's one side of managing pain. And but yet her identity is clearly mixed up in what she does. So that question of what is reasonable suffering, right? Like,
Right.
Is connected to how you understand reasonable and how that's connected to identity, and that's that would need to sort of be explored.
Yeah, and the whole issue of agency, even in the treatment itself, it seems to me, is because it's not an unalloyed, oh, give me marijuana, I want it, I want it, I want it. She is part of this acculturation about how bad it is, for her to be using it. So I don't know. Anything else on Lorraine? How about we look at Peter, because he's obviously in crisis right now, trauma at the end of the episode.
Right.
He certainly didn't choose anything.
He does seem stuck, like sort of really fearful of making a decision, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah, I have a lot of empathy for him in the way that he, is handling or not handling the issue of coming out. That painful discussion that the two guys have in bed about who I can tell, or I guess I can't tell anybody, or whatever. What a mess that all is.
Right.
But as far as the injuries that he has there, and as far as looking at a way of, dealing with pastoral care in the face of trauma.
Right. Yeah. So I guess I was thinking pastoral care in terms of like his crisis of identity, but you're right.
Yeah.
So it has a physical crisis.
Right.
As well. Right. Yeah. Well, and then the family as a whole will be dealing with that as well. And I wonder if we'll see them. I'm sure we will see Adam thinking about his own culpability, or how they might have responsibility for how things played out.
Yeah. I don't know what you say in that kind of a situation. I mean, this is uncalled for pain and uncalled for suffering that's going on. It's obviously acute at this point. We hope it's not terminal.
It makes me think of the last question on our questions. The difference between curing and healing is his body certainly is in need of curing, but there's the identity issue behind all of this, and
right.
I wouldn't know, but I assume there might be some guilt and some complicated feelings about who he is and how this came about. So that's where the healing side of, I think.
Right, and unfortunately, in this case, the physical issue may precipitate some of that stuff in a way that it may not have come to. So I think, Shada, you're right. I think it's all of one piece, probably. But I mean, why did you get beat up? I got beat up because people thought I was, gay.
Right. I don't think they'll be able to hide it from his grandfather now.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. So it's complicated. I wonder if this is a generalization, that every kind of physical trauma like that is going to have this constellation of social things that surround it, like the identity stuff that goes there, that in the moment we're talking about the crisis of physical cure, but there's a larger issue always of the healing.
I like that, Michael. I think that's this Peter situation is a good reminder of that. That there's always it's more complicated. It's always more.
That's it. Yeah. I'm thinking of the little old lady that falls and breaks her hip, but there's a whole social setup that goes along with that.
Right.
Was she by herself? Why was she? Yeah.
Right.
Why was she out? She wants to be independent, but she can't be anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And there's
Right.
Yeah. It's never simple.
Yeah.
And and in terms of Peter and the book of Daniel, they haven't really. It was okay. So I want at the end scene, right? Jesus is standing there at the scene, right?
Yes.
The police car, right? And so, right, the sense of that Jesus was there, Jesus was not turning away in that situation, right? So they're making theological claims around, around the issue of homosexuality, right? Like that subtly, because they haven't really, like, it's all been familial, right? It's all been like these issues of identity and coming out in terms of family and somewhat social structures, but it's been very it hasn't been theological. It's been, I don't know what's the word, like
personal. Yeah. No,
yeah.
I'm with you.
Right, but suddenly with this last scene, right? They're bringing in the theology, and so. Right. So it made me think that I don't really have it. Like if we were approaching a pastoral situation with Peter at this point, from what we know, I don't really know how Peter thinks about God. And certainly that will be mixed in with losing his brother, but like there would be potentially exploration around all of that stuff, which we just don't have. We don't have that information right now.
Right. No, makes sense. Well, we've kind of come to our end of our list of questions. Is there anything else anybody wants to throw in for the good of the order?
I don't want to go too long, but I'm really curious about the question of choosing suffering. I don't know if we want to just address that briefly, but I certainly have known people who have, for attention-seeking purposes or making it part of their identity. I have a family member who certainly suffers so that she can play the victim. But I don't know how. I mean, is it always a choice? That's kind of the question that I'm wrestling with.
And there's another layer too that I played around with, is like suffering good, suffering bad sort of deal. Like I choose sometimes to hold on to things, to work things out in a weird way, as opposed to it's always bad to suffer. And I wonder if, there's something else going on there too. It goes back to the very beginning of the reading about patience, and like, is it a good thing to have this space? I don't know.
Yeah, like I don't think we quite have the vocabulary to articulate what we're trying to say here, right? Which is that there is pain, and then there's the way you choose to react to the pain, which many times is still going to feel like pain.
Right.
But the extent to which that pain is entered into, right, maybe will be called suffering or not, depending like on what definitions we're using. I mean, because there is a lot, like Adam, you mentioned, like Buddhism, right? There's a lot of in the practice of Buddhism to not block or ignore or avoid suffering, but like to actually experience it, because in the experience of it, then you will also like learn to experience equanimity and compassion, and then also the sense of like we continue to re-experience things that we pretend we're not experiencing, right? But that when suffering is fully experienced, we can also then entertain the possibility of letting it go. So, right, that sort of plays into what you're saying, like good, bad, suffering. Like we don't have different words to explain those different aspects of it, right? And so I agree, Adam. I think the way Emerson talked about it, whether it was a choice to suffer, I think is a little bit simplistic, but I think choice is present and really active in suffering. But I don't have the right language to explain it right now.
Well, and it takes us back to the whole question of why Jesus, why God sent Jesus into the world and why he went through that. Is he choosing to suffer? Yes, I have to say, I guess he is. Could he have done it some other way? I don't know, but this is what he chose. And this is the experiencing that you were talking about, Shada, is exactly what I imagined God thinking or dreaming as he decided to send Jesus. I don't know. It again establishes our relationship with him.
Right.
I think what you're saying, Shad, is what I was thinking about with contemplative meditation, where you recognize pain, acknowledge it, and then name it and let it go.
Right.
I think maybe that's you reflecting that helps me to think about it in terms of pastoral care as well. How do we can't tell people that's what they're doing. That's not helpful. But to say,
right.
What are you feeling, to get people to see the real pain that they're holding and how they're choosing to keep that suffering in their lives. Not that it will go away easily, but to help them, whether it's physical or mental or spiritual pain, to help them look at it directly, right?
Yeah.
So that it can be named and so that we can see what choice we do have.
Right.
That's helpful. Yeah.
Good deal. Okay, I guess we'll call it a day. Thanks, guys.
Woo.
Fun as always. We'll stop the broadcast and then we'll chat for a second.